Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us for today's exciting discussion on Canada's growing defense sector. Thank you for your patience. It seems no matter how advanced we get with our technology, technical difficulties will continue to scourge us. I'm Danish Hassan, Senior Manager at BDO Canada with our government incentives practice. Before we get started, I'll quickly cover a few housekeeping items. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please try refreshing your browser first. If the issue persists, you can use the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen and let us know. Somebody from our team will assist you as quickly as possible. Now, if you have questions for the panelists during the discussion, please submit them using the chat function. We'll be collecting all the questions and we'll address as many as possible when we get to the Q&A session at the end. Now, if we can't get to your question, we do have a quick poll that's going to appear right now. You can navigate it through the right-hand tab, and we'll do it again at the end of our discussion. If you're interested in keeping the conversation going, please feel free to let us know. If you're thinking of growth in this sector, we would love to hear from you. Okay, let's begin. Today's session is designed to be practical for SMEs, larger firms, and the ecosystem partners that support them. We'll discuss first, where the opportunities are emerging in this changing landscape. Second, what readiness really means when it comes to operations and scaling. And finally, third, funding strategy with a focus on government incentives, where we'll touch a little bit on M&A as well. With that, let's get started with some quick introductions. We're joined by Mindy Pierce, Director at CADSI, the leading national association for Canada's defense industry and supplier ecosystem. Mindy brings over 25 years of experience advising senior officials and has been at CADSI since 2019, previously leading their policy and government relations, now Director of Memberships. We also have Garrett Tone, Executive Director at Invest Ontario, which is the province's one window for supporting foreign direct investment and business expansion in the province. Over the last 20 years, Garrett has held a variety of senior leadership roles in multiple industries. He leads the defense and life sciences portfolios for IBO. Next is Paul Dostler, Partner Technology and National Manufacturing Leader at BDO Canada, advising clients on modernization. So everything from ERP, automation, data to productivity, especially where operational readiness becomes a competitive differentiator, a key theme for today. Finally, we have Julien Lesson, Partner Credits and Incentives at BDO Canada. Julien and his team advise a broad range of stakeholders, including in defense, on incentives. With industry experience, including roles with Thales and Lockheed Martin, and over 20 years in incentives advisory, Julien brings a cross-border perspective to complex funding considerations. So to keep the session useful and on track, I remind our panelists to keep their responses to about a minute, 75 seconds, additional comments to about another 20 seconds, and I may jump in to keep us on time. Mindy, I'm going to start with you first. There's a lot of excitement around defense. Do you see a real paradigm shift? And from CADSI's vantage point, where are you seeing opportunities show up most clearly for suppliers and SMEs?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I think we're seeing some real momentum in Canada's defense sector now, but it's important to understand that defense moves slowly and deliberately, right? So what's changing isn't just the spending, it's also with the structure. So the government is shifting away from one-off purchases towards long-term capability and capacity building with a much stronger focus on Canadian industry participation, supply chain resilience, and alignment with allies like NATO. The budget shows intent, but you'll see that spending rolls out over many years, and there's been an enhanced focus on dual-use technologies or commercial tech adapted for military use.
Excellent. Thanks for that context, Mindy. Julien, I want to bring you in on this. Given your defense and incentives background, where are you seeing the most meaningful opportunities emerge, and what should companies really be paying attention to over the next 2 or 3 years?
So, well, that's a big question, Danish. There's no doubt that the Canadian government investments in defense are massive compared to the previous decades. So several distinct strategies can be developed to take advantage of the various opportunities this creates. And obviously, it could be very interesting to explore what this means for a given company. From my perspective, the most meaningful opportunities are emerging in the parts of the value chain where Canada is explicitly trying to build sovereign capability and where mid-sized firms can realistically compete. The new defense industrial strategy points to areas like aerospace and avionics, ammunition and munition, digital systems such as secure communications, AI, command and control, and service support in MROs, sensors in electronic warfare, space and ISR, specialized manufacturing for land and marine systems, training simulation, and uncrewed and autonomous systems. There's a lot. For many Canadian mid-sized firms, the opportunity is less about becoming the prime, obviously, but more about becoming a strong subsystem. So a digital or a specialized manufacturing partner inside those programs. So the other thing companies should also be paying very close attention is to the incentive landscape that sits around that growth. It was already difficult to track the right programs a few years ago, and now it's becoming even more dynamic as new agencies, streams, and defense-specific support come online. And we're seeing also so many historic incentives initially dedicated to other industries now adding new defense components, budget, and streams to their programs. So my advice is that companies should assign some internal responsibility for monitoring that landscape and managing the application process, even if they ultimately bring outside help. But it's important because these programs can materially support scaling, technology adoption, and market entry, but only if someone is actively managing the timing, fit, and follow through. These programs can be used also beyond your organization. So since they can, for example, help to secure business deals and technological collaborative project with business partners. An example would be a decent stacking of collaborative research grants and provincial federal tax credits that can help to close a negotiation with a larger player who might hesitate to work with you for business reasons. Another quick component is if you start to addressing Canadian defense needs with your product or service, you might want to look at opportunities beyond Canada borders as well, particularly in US and Europe. You likely realize that Canada can now qualify under the European Defense Strategy through a condition exemption scheme based on the EU-Canada partnership across the SAFE, or the Security Action for Europe program. And this is not a complete opening of the European market, but rather a selective integration within the framework of a geopolitical alliance. Canada now enjoys that exceptional and unprecedented status following the signing of this security and defense partnership in June last year. And again, there are some incentives that can support these type of cross-border innovation and investment projects with European players. Might be worth exploring.
Thank you so much, Julian. We'll get a little bit more into on the credits and incentive side. I was hoping to bring Garrett in for grounding this discussion on the Ontario side, but I know he's having some technical difficulties joining us. Hopefully, he'll join soon. But maybe translating some of this grounding on the opportunity and some initial actions to think about. Paul, I'd like to bring you in on translating what this means in terms of the business. Like, what are 2 or 3 internal readiness metrics or themes that businesses should be paying attention to in the near term, let's say the next 12 to 24 months, to make sure they're not caught flat-footed around some of the market opportunities as well as the incentive opportunities that are going to come in the next year or so?
Yeah, certainly. I think the right angle here is to reflect on what the market environment might be like when we approach this kind of economy. And so, they've announced defense spending a while back. We're talking today about some great incentive programs. It's absolutely creating a buzz. And what we're seeing at the various roundtables, conferences that we're attending, is that there are a lot of organizations, a lot of manufacturers that are showing up. They want to participate. They want to capture some of that funding. So what that tells us is that it's likely going to be a very competitive environment to bid in. So we also have to acknowledge who our client is likely to be. And so in the defense sector, they're very much known for operating with lean processes. They measure process efficiency and effectiveness. And chances are that they're going to expect that same kind of measurability from the vendor ecosystem themselves. So from a compliance perspective, I think most people have seen that there will be some programs like the control goods programs that we'll need to comply with. There's a cybersecurity one that's also coming into place. But I think there's a likely expectation that organizations are going to have to demonstrate that efficiency in their business processes. And so are you today able to show how your processes lead to the speed at which you can operate, the quality of the products that you produce, the reliability at which you can meet the demand? So maybe the overarching question is, how auditable are your processes today, and what can you do to be able to let a prospective client come in and assess that for you? From a competitive perspective, I think organizations are going to they're going to need to get very, very strong in terms of understanding where their margins come from. And so do you understand your margins, again, in the manufacturing context, per product, per SKU? Are you able to be nimble and look across your product suite and kind of vary the profit from one line to another in order to meet a certain competitive ask? So what's in top of mind for many of our clients right now is, how sophisticated is your cost accounting? Do you have that built into your ERP? Is this something that you have as an automated reporting process, or is it something that you do periodically? And really, is that good enough to be fully responsive to the demand? One more theme that I wanted to touch on was visibility. So we had a chance to meet with some representatives from the Canadian Army, and they were very open about the fact that they do not know. You cannot expect that they will know what the manufacturing sector has to offer. So there is a visibility problem. They were very quick to say that their procurement technology isn't quite up to speed to allow them to know that. And so the recommendation there is that, as a manufacturer, what do you want to be known for, right? How are you going to promote yourself in that way? Do you plan to sell directly into Canada, or do you plan to be a vendor in the supply chain ecosystem? And how are you going to navigate that? So one concept that came out that was interesting is they talked about supply chain illumination. And so think of the end product that the defense sector will buy, and think of all the components that make it up. And then think of which one of those components, whether it be a zipper on a piece of an apparel or a button, and think of it that way. Be known as being the best person to supply that product, and then navigate the supply chain that way. So there's no ambiguity. You can't approach this and say, I can do whatever you'd like. No, you need to know your place, and you need to market yourself that way.
Paul, you brought up a couple of really interesting points. So one is on the competitiveness and knowing price points, margins, and the other was having an auditable process. And I think that really resonates with the requirements that, Mindy, you might be hearing from some of your old members and new members. And so on that, if I'm a company watching today and seriously considering defense, what's the smartest first step that I should take before actively, diving into the market?
Sorry, had to find the mute button. First time online, just kidding. So I think the smartest first move before chasing contracts is to do your prep work, right? So you need to be able to clearly articulate exactly what Paul was saying, right? So why do you want to work in defense? What do you have to offer? And you may even be asked to prove why you think you can work in defense, right? So you have to show those certifications. Oftentimes they also want to see some maturity in it. So if you're not a huge corporation, you're likely going to want to enter defense space as a supply chain partner rather than a direct supplier to D&D. This will help you get a feel for the defense ecosystem. And if you commit to learning the ecosystem early, I think you'll find that it pays off later, right? So the first meeting you get with a prime, it's probably going to be 15 to 20 minutes long. It's likely going to be at a B2B meetup or at their booth somewhere at some trade show. The goal here is to get to the next meeting when you can have the in-depth conversation with them and you can tell them what you're really good at, right? So you can't do everything. Even a welding shop, yes, you can build everything, but your contractor will know that you want to focus on a certain area, right? So make sure that you can explain to them what your specific value proposition is, right? So that prime contractor already has somewhere between 400 and 1,500 companies in their supply chain. They want to know that you can provide a differentiator over your competitors, right? It could be just reshoring the single source of supply back to Canada. It's a huge benefit right now with the Buy Canadian momentum behind us. And other things that you should do ahead of time, do your research, right? So what are that prime contractor working on? Are you in their database of approved suppliers? Do you know what their requirements are for their suppliers? Have you started closing any of those requirements gaps, compliance-wise or other? And do you have a general understanding of Canada's offset program? If you don't know the ITB policy, the Industrial Technological Benefits Policy, that would be another great place to start.
That's great insight, and maybe just quickly, if I'm thinking of, okay, I'm not going to supply prime, but maybe I'm going to supply the tier 2. What are some 2 or 3? I think Paul mentioned control goods. So did you? The new cybersecurity policy. What are some things that you should start immediately, because maybe there's long lead times, or even the suppliers want to see a little bit of maturity when it comes to implementing?
Absolutely. So I think the incoming cybersecurity requirements, if you Google it now, PSBC is launching it later on this month. I believe there's a webinar coming up on April 21st. So I highly recommend that you check that out. The cybersecurity requirements, they are not going to be optional. There's a slow ramp up right now, but at some point, everybody in the world is going to require a high level of cybersecurity, a cyber hygiene, as they call it. The earlier you start, the longer you can spread it out. And don't get tripped over the word cyber. It actually will scope in your entire organization, okay? Because it's about access control, people movement, and who should be seeing what and who should not be seeing stuff,
no
right?
tailgating at the door.
Exactly, right? So there are companies out there that are providing these types of services as, kind of like security as a service. There's cloud service providers. If you say I'm looking to operate in the defense sector and I want to meet CSSP, which is Canadian Program for Cybersecurity Certification, is the Canadian version. The American version is called CMMC, Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. So they are slightly different. They're complementary, but it will take quite a bit of a lift and an investment into your organization if you're not already meeting some of those NIST 800 standards.
Awesome. And so we've covered the opportunity. We've covered when companies start moving, what should they think about? I think, Julien, maybe it's a good time to bring you in to talk about how to think about growth and next steps. Given your experience in both defense and leading incentives advisory, which funding mechanisms or programs should companies, whether they're Canadian or international, be considering when they evaluate an investment in Canada? Because we know there's a lot out there.
Of course, yes. So, well, I would have 2 points to make on the subject. First, the opportunity is real, but the support architecture around it is changing so quickly. The creation of the Defense Investment Agency is a major signal that Ottawa wants a more coordinated, easier to navigate system for defense investments and industrial growth. But at the same time, companies now have multiple doors, depending on their size, province, and project stage. So it's a bit hard to understand as a context. So, for example, under the Regional Defense Investment Initiative, we'll have the RDII program. Business in Southern Ontario could normally request between $125,000 and $10 million in interest-free repayable support through FedDev Ontario, with FedDev covering up to 75% of eligible cost and totaling a total of a government support that could be reaching up to 100%. So it's quite generous. Across Canada, Prairie Scan, Pacific Can, and ACOA have similar vehicles. However, as you know, Danish, we have supported companies in this industry that have applied to different funding. For example, one of our clients is a DNA firm, received a 100 million grant from the RTRI program. And a lot of companies don't know that the threshold for eligibility is tariff exposure, not direct significant impact per se. So, similarly, there is a significant support to be derived from programs that aren't necessarily focused on defense, but which have developed specific funding streams with dedicated defense budget or new eligibility criteria for defense project. Within the R&D, we discussed ideas, but there's the scientific research and experimental development, tax credits, obviously. The NRC's IRAP program across Canada that alone can provide grants reaching up to 80% of the project costs with dedicated budgets for defense. We have the IP box tax incentives in Alberta and Quebec, which are significant corporate tax reduction rate on revenue generated by IP developed in these provinces. And more generally, investment, job creation, productivity incentives across the country. For larger and more transformational project, the conversation shifts. So officially, the Strategic Response Fund starts at the project with at least $20 million in total eligible cost and a minimum of 10 million contribution. But in practical terms, many companies should think of SRF as a 40 to 50 million plus conversation once you factor in the level of due diligence, co-funding, execution expected, because it's quite a large endeavor. It's probably the largest funding program available in Canada. Great tool, but a complex tool to use for sure. That could be something to look at for larger partnerships or investments. Well, just understand meeting the minimum threshold does not mean that your project will be funded. Obviously, for SRF, IVO, Invest Quebec SOR, the upcoming BC Strategic Investment Fund, the BC SIF, you have to find the game-changing aspect of your project for these larger projects. Is it supply chain independence, first of a kind in Canada or in the province, a good amount of job creation, an angle where you fit in a key spot in one of Canada's strategy? You must find and sharpen the compelling edges to win against other projects, or revise your scope, your project, or revise the vehicle you're after as well. So the real strategic question is just not what program exists, it's which door fits your size, your province, and your project, and in what order should we pursue them. If companies can answer that well, the stacking of these programs is right and supported together, they can materially improve the project's economics and IRR. So sometimes the idea is to approach it from the opposite angle as well. So defining what your financial needs are to succeed, and then look for the proper incentives that will allow you to meet these criteria and achieve your objectives. I mean, defining the needs, not just in the target amount or government incentives or the percentage of the project to be funded, but also the repayment terms, the conditionality of the soft loans to be repayable or not, the timing and the management. For example, it's sometimes better to secure slightly smaller amounts where the portion of the upfront payment is much larger, or the total size would be larger, to avoid having to raise equity, or even negotiating payments deferral when possible and adding a warrant in exchange for better conditions or favorable terms that will allow you to achieve these financial goals and convince your board or any other decision-making bodies in your organization to go forward with the project. So that's why I think I would strongly encourage to really pay close attention to this financial subject and assign internal ownership for this, even if you bring outside help as well. But I think it's already hard to track incentives a few years ago. Now, with the new agency, the new stacking possibilities, the regional stream and defense-specific support emerging at the same time, it's just too complicated or to have a casual management of it.
Thanks, Julien. I think there's so much to unpack there. So, I think what we're hearing is there's a lot of programs. Some of them might be focused on defense, some of them aren't, for example, the RTRI, but you can still apply to those programs if you fit certain parameters. And then the second part is you have to know, what scale you're at, right? And then have a concrete plan. And maybe I was hoping to get Garrett to chime in on this a little bit, is what players can sometimes get wrong. Having been on the funding side myself at Invest Ontario, we see a lot of players, whether small or large, often mess up and not have a clear project defined or not have clear timelines. And that can really sort of get in the way. And maybe I can bring you in on your perspective. Have you kind of heard that sort of feedback from membership where they have stumbled a little bit, and what were some of those stumbling blocks?
Apologies. So I think there's nothing really specific. Every company is unique, right? So I think everybody has a different challenge. So this is where it's a challenge for CADSI or any like-minded association because our membership is so broad and diverse. And it's also defense is cyclical, right? So there's some years where it's export permits are almost impossible to get. We've had that for a few years. There's a huge backlog, right? So CADSI helped sort of on the casework, permit by permit type thing, but also on the large P policy bit about trying to unstick the systemic challenges. But I think that's where companies tend to kind of get hung up if we're looking at the financial tools is not understanding the rules of defense. So with the ITB policy, the industrial technological benefits, our offsets policy here in Canada, not every small business is necessarily eligible to be, an ITB donor, as it's called. So depending on where your funding is coming from, that if it's not through an approved mechanism or government source or something like that, it could make you ineligible for some of the government defense type programs. So it's really good to sort of, understand that and the trade-off in that area as well.
Excellent. Paul, maybe to bring it in from a growth and modernization perspective, what differentiates companies that can successfully scale into the defense market from those that struggle? We talked a little bit about incentives, but what about an operational point of view?
Well, that's it. And quite honestly, what scaling looks like from a technology perspective from one organization might look very different from another, but maybe I can offer a few guiding thoughts here. In our experience, when we scale, again, specifically in manufacturing, but I think this is applicable across many industries, the bottleneck usually resides with people. And I don't necessarily mean the labor capacity. That is absolutely a challenge as well. But it's more so where your subject matter expertise lies. So there gets a point where you end up with one person or a very small group of people that have some corporate knowledge that doesn't exist anywhere else. And in order to scale, you would effectively have to scale those people. And that takes a lot of time. They have a career's worth of information within their heads. So, that makes me reflect on the purpose of automation. And when we think of automation, the first thing you go to is like, okay, I'm going to take a process and I'm going to automate it. And so I'm going to be able to repeat it very, very quickly, automatically, right, by definition. But what you're actually doing is that you're effectively building or digitizing often human knowledge into technology. And so that's one way that you can insulate yourself from that SME bottleneck scenario. And that's one of the ways that's going to allow you to scale. And then perhaps your next issue will be labor, and there's other ways to address that. And part of that, I certainly couldn't leave this webinar without talking about AI. I think we've all heard a lot about AI. So again, I'm going to say stay as generic as I can, but let's face it, AI is here, AI is making a difference, and it's up to us to adopt it. So here at BDO, we absolutely believe that the future is human-led, but AI-assisted. And so how do we advance in that journey towards truly being AI-assisted? I think of three themes, or you could think of them as overlapping phases. The first one is digitization. It's kind of how we define modernization and digital transformation for the last many years. Digitization will help you get deeper visibility into your own organization. It's going to help you add that level of insights to make better decisions. Fairly clear. Then there's the automation that I talked about, leveraging some of that digitization to really add that scale and that resilience to scaling. But then you really get into AI adoption. And this is something that is changing, dare I say, almost every day, right? So AI has the potential to be your productivity multiplier, but you have to understand that AI is not some kind of tool that you just make accessible to your people. It truly is a change in the way you operate, a change in mindset. And so adopting AI is really about change management and technology and measuring ROI and a flurry of other things. And so it's organizational change as a whole.
Thank you for that, Paul. When we talk about change management, I think Mindy, in our previous conversations, you talked a lot about how, given the changes in the defense sector, there's a lot of M&A activity that's now coming up. I just wanted to get your take on what you're seeing in terms of readiness for Canadian companies to start entering those discussions.
So I think it's still early days right now. Canada is a supplier nation historically, right? So for the past 75 years, we've been the primary supplier to the United States. We make very few platforms here in Canada, with the exception of the light armored vehicle out of London, and then the two shipbuilders on each coast. So there's a bit in space, we're making platforms there, but generally what we're seeing is Canada is always sort of we're the niche suppliers, the parts and components, which is great. And we make some really exquisite, high quality pieces, but we don't see ourselves as the platform, designers and deliverers. I think that's changing. You're going to see it with the Navy as well, whether they're buying offshore or they're building in Canada. Canada is definitely looking to become more of the build at home. To do that, 90% of our industry right now is small and medium enterprises, right? So in defense, we define that as under 250 employees. We need to scale. We need those mergers. We need those acquisitions as well in order to compete on a global stage.
And maybe just for everyone else's benefit that's listening, you mentioned that in defense you see it as 250 and smaller. When it comes to funding programs for the federal government, it's usually 500 full-time employees and small. So we have to keep a track of everyone's various definitions of what big and small means.
That's right. So it's a good clarification, because it can be a little bit different, because a lot of times defense companies in Canada, so D&D buys very, very infrequently, right? So usually defense companies have to choose another adventure, whether they're going to go commercial or they're going to export. And if you're going on a commercial line, yeah, you're right. You might be able to get all kinds of funding under different streams for your commercial bit. But for ISET and for the ITB policy, it is 250 employees. So you just heard, that's where I was saying, dig into the ecosystem, sort of figure this stuff out. Your regional development agencies, as well as Invest Ontario and others like that, have a really deep knowledge, and they've been working with those programs for decades, so they can help you too.
Awesome. Julien, what are some additional considerations around M&A that companies should keep in mind in this sector? We talked about ITB, and I think it's particularly relevant when it comes to exits and how they mix with incentives as well.
Yeah, Danish, that's indeed a very relevant question, because in this sector, M&A strategy is closely intertwined with the industrial and technological benefit frameworks. The company winning major contracts must fulfill the ITB obligations, as you know, typically by investing in Canada an amount equivalent to the contract value. Within that context, certain transactions can qualify under the investment framework, which allows eligible investments, particularly in R&D, technology partnership, capability building assets, to generate ITB credits with multipliers for up to 9 times the initial investment could be counted for. This makes it extremely advantageous for the primes to target acquisition or partnerships that enhances the technological capabilities in Canada. So minority investment should not be underestimated. Non-controlling equity investment in Canadian companies can qualify as allowable cash investment under the ITB rules and may benefit from the same multiplier effects, especially when tied to R&D, IP, equipment, knowledge transfer. In practice, this creates a strong incentive to rethink traditional M&A approaches and consider minority stakes as a strategic lever, especially when strengthening relationship with key suppliers, customers, or innovation partners. The financial impact of an ITB standpoint can be substantial. Also, venture capital fund structure offer another option. Investment channeled through eligible funds into Canadian advanced technology SMEs can generate ITBs with multipliers, typically up to 5, depending. But this provides an alternative to direct acquisitions while still allowing companies to meet their target obligations and gain exposure to innovation ecosystem. Finally, it's equally important to consider the reverse perspective. If you are a target of or partner in a transaction linked to a prime contractor's ITB commitments, your project or your contract may effectively constitute ITB contributions. While it's possible and often very desirable to leverage government incentives to reduce the cost of these investments, you must be careful to assess the interaction between those incentives obtained for the project and the ITB credit eligibility. In particular, non-repayable contributions such as grants, subsidies can reduce the value of the eligible ITB expenditure. In contrast, a structured financing instrument such as a repayable contribution or a soft loan may be significantly more advantageous in some circumstances. In some cases, for example, when the appropriate structure, including, for example, the use of warrants that could what could otherwise be government assistance contaminating the ITB, could be characterized as a financial investment, therefore abiding and minimizing any reduction of the ITB credits. So ultimately, a successful M&A approach in this space require aligning transaction strategy with ITB rules and optimal incentive stacking to optimize both compliance objectives and financial outcomes, in my mind.
Thanks so much for that, Julien. Maybe just very quickly, I have a follow-up question for you, but I'll ask you to keep it quite short, maybe to a minute max. We talked about, how with M&A, there's a lot involved with the color of money, especially, who you're dealing with, considerations of ITB benefits. And so there is some complexity that you have to internally deal with as an organization. We talked about what sometimes companies get wrong in terms of approaching incentives, whether that's Investissement Québec, Invest Ontario, SRF, some of the basics. What are 2 or 3 things that sometimes even sophisticated players might not get right or might not optimize when it comes to incentives?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll try to make it quick, but sophisticated large players often do well. They have dedicated teams, which is something I strongly suggest for monitoring projects arising in order to apply to the best known incentives and actively preparing the claims. And we do work with them very often, these internal teams, but still it's easy to, one, be missing new programs. Obviously, one issue maybe to missing a new credit or grant, which is forgivable given how often the new programs are introduced, new funding windows are announced so often, and eligibility criteria changes. So that might be one thing. The other one would be to run with program applications, but fail to really optimize the stacking strategy, the combination or the combinative calculation, if you will, or the simulation of the combined effect from a specific incentives stacking strategy. It's key to optimize what would, for example, sometimes be a stacking of 4, 5, or 6 programs together to better fund a single large strategic project. So often just playing with those parameters and negotiating more sophisticated terms and conditions can be very advantageous, and seeking out programs with more attractive features to better align with the overall financial structure you're searching for can secure government assistance that is much more important and have a greater impact for you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Julien. And, it's interesting because I think, a lot of companies, especially when it comes to tax credits, things like SHRED and, other ITCs, there are now financing vehicles for that. And that's something that's relatively new in Canada. The banks didn't used to do this. There's some specialty lenders. So those are all excellent points on things that the sophisticated players might miss. Minnie, really quickly, if I'm not brand new in this industry, I have a toe in the water and now thinking of growing, what are your members telling you they wish they'd understood before making that growth step?
Trying to think if there's some generic advice. Again, everybody's a little bit different. So I think it really comes in coming prepared, understanding what it is that you're capable of doing and what you can realistically offer, right? So you're looking at either becoming the new supplier, so switching out somebody else, you should be able to deliver on that, because I'm going to tell you, it is a very small sector. You learn it. You get to know people very quickly because it is so small. So often your reputation will precede you, right? So if you don't get it right when you're smaller, it's going to be more difficult when you're trying to scale. I think for a long time, the ITB policy, it incented companies to keep it at 249 employees and less as a business strategy. I think you're going to see with the additional with the DIS, there's some additional ITB changes going to be rolling out, where you're going to see probably some change in that mid cap. So something in the scalability. So TBC, because so far I don't actually have a lot of good advice to pass along. A lot of times it's we can't scale because there's a cliff because of the ITB policy.
Awesome. Thank you. Maybe before we go on to our lightning round, I'm going to maybe just speak for Garrett, as I unfortunately doesn't seem to have been able to join us. One of the things that I wanted to ask Garrett was, how does one approach Invest Ontario? What's the difference on the scale of projects that one goes to Invest Ontario or one of the regional funds? And I think you can apply this lesson across the major strategic funds in the provinces and the federal government versus, what are the smaller regional programs. Generally, the rule of thumb that used to have at Invest Ontario when I was there was $100 million, 100 jobs. Now, I don't think that's particularly true for 2026, especially now where we're trying to grow this defense industry. I wish Garrett could speak to it directly, but I have a feeling it's more in the 50 million, 75 jobs category. I will have to get Garrett to, don't quote me on this, but I think that's kind of where they've landed. And of course, the regional funds, whether it's FedDev, funds like AMIC, SWATF, EODF, any project that's $1 million or $2 million more is interesting, particularly if it's something that's going to enhance the competitiveness of your business and the sector. So if you're, replacing a roof and some old machinery, probably not going to be very interesting. But, if you're doing a few things that lead to productivity gains, digitization, those kinds of things are super compelling. So those are some of the things that you want to think about. With that, I'll start with the lightning round. And before we do that, just a reminder that our poll is there. So if you want to keep the conversation going, please select one of those options. I'll start with you, Paul, and then go on to Mindy and Julien. What's one action that you would encourage companies to take in the next 90 days to better position themselves for defense-related growth?
Take stock of your management systems, look into the transparency in your processes, and understand where your margins come from so you can be competitive.
Awesome. Mindy. Okay, it's not one thing though, guys. I'm not the accountant, so I'm not going to count this. But you got it. You have to do that internal defense readiness check, right? So, what's your cyber hygiene? When are you realistically going to be able to close any of those gaps? Your quality controls, your capacity and scalability. Are you export ready, or is that something you need to explore? What's your Canadian content value? Then, so once you've sort of discovered more about your own company, what's your realistic entry point, right? So one program, one prime or tier 2, 3, and one capability. What are you looking to supply in the defense sector to dip a toe in that water? And I would recommend that you begin building relationships before the RFP exists. Defense companies team 7 to 10 years in advance.
Wow. Julien.
On my end, the final takeaway, well, I would start, I would say that if you have growth plans that are considering incentives, ensure you engage early. That's absolutely key. Timing is of the essence here. Some of these programs can be quite long to apply for. It could be sometimes quite surprising. Second, assigning a core internal team member to help manage this. Even if you engage in an advisory team like ours, obviously, but it's important to identify acute opportunities and monitor the long term. Assigning a champion in your organization for managing incentives can help to better leverage sources of fund, obviously, and achieve more optimal financial structure. It can help to reduce your costs of operations, your costs of investments, but it's also good for your clients as it can cover the work you do with them. So providing a discount for your client on your invoices, if you will, for example. It can also be good for your partners to foster collaboration and close deals that can sometimes get stuck in indecision.
Excellent. Thank you. That wraps up our sort of planned session. We now have time for some Q&A. I'm just going through the chat here. I see there's a question on, and this is whoever wants to take the question. What are the security screening requirements? So for some of the regulatory and compliance, what are some things that companies should watch out for, prepare for as they begin to take that step?
I think the first thing they need to look at is the controlled goods program. So most Canadian defense contractors require it. Even if you're selling something that is kind of more on the commercial side, if you're going to be supplying into defense, controlled goods is likely going to come into play. So I would strongly recommend that you take a look at that. And that includes digital assets too. It's not just physical. Now we have control goods in the cloud and we have new guidance for those. So that piece, in terms of security clearance, most people need a reliability or enhanced reliability screening at minimum. But I want to let you guys know that incoming security clearance requirements are going to go much higher, right? F-35s, even the paint requires security clearance on this stuff. So as the level of the security around the defense articles increases, likewise, it's going to be put on companies. The onus will be on you and your employees to make sure that you're meeting those higher levels.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Mindy. Couple of other questions that I'm seeing come through. How can Canadian companies tap into funding from ITBs resulting from large OEM sales in Canada? Who would like to take that?
I can take that at one again too, or someone else is welcome to as well. So
then you beat Julien to it, so we'll start with you, Mindy.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead then.
I would say that you need to go and meet. You need to network, right? So the biggest thing is you need to be touching base with these prime contractors regularly. I said if you Google ITB obligations, you will find a list of all of the obligators or obligors in Canada, and you can find out what's left to identify in each of their programs. But it's not enough to send an email. Those inboxes have 50,000 emails in them. You have to show up to events. You have to provide, your sort of your 10-second or your 3-minute overview of what you have to offer, because really it's the OEM's supply chain management team that is going to be looking to work with you on those ITBs. Julien, you can go into more of
good point. Yeah, nobody you covered it properly. There's a few factors. Obviously, the public information is quite useful. Know that these players have partners, so it's not only just the prime, but the others that can be also targets for a discussion. And even those that are not eligible to properly do the ITB, but it could be partnering with you to propose a project that could be eligible to the ITB, could be a good idea as well if they're more connected with you and you have a connection with these guys. So there's a lot of strategy about understanding what's the framework of the ecosystem around these larger projects. And it could be sometimes a project that is directly linked to the contract, but it could be also a side, and there's different criteria of eligibility to the ITB that goes beyond just providing the good that was under the contract. So if you understand everything, that could be something from that company that is not linked to that, but still meets the criteria of the ITB, that provides way more options. And thinking, so you can open the discussion with them as well, seeing we know that you have this is that as other business units that can relate to some extent to what we do, what we could do together, make proposals. So be proactive on having ideas of how you can provide a deal, how you can structure something, what would be the investment, and how would it be funded? Where will be the ideal funding structure so that it reduces the cost of the investment for everybody, but it doesn't reduce and maximize the ITB at the same time. So it's a double play where if you prepare it properly, even with a project that would be like as compelling as the others. If your funding structure, your maximization of the ITB is properly thought of, you would pass way beyond the others.
Excellent. Thanks, Julien. We've got another question around advice for technology startups. So what is the TRL level or technology readiness level to tap into funding and incentives?
Maybe I can take a part of it. Obviously, larger projects are typically a bit less innovative, so higher TRLs, lower TRLs are smaller projects in dollars. So we have more of these grants that support collaborative research of lower TRLs. There's a lot of these programs, very generous, but typically cover less. But for SME, it could be, or a startup could be really interesting. Uh, uh, for these large players, sometimes including a startup in their investment project that is not that innovative could make the investment more innovative. Therefore, they could be getting also a multiplier under the framework because of that change in the project. It fits structured properly. So it's really about thinking, what can you bring to these corporations? Where could there be an incentive that would be good for you, so that it unlocks like funding to reduce the cost of the invoices that you would send to the big player, and the overall result of undertaking this project would make their big thing more innovative, therefore increasing the ITB contribution. So if you play it with all these parameters at the same time and you are prepared, you explain this education to the big players might be as important as what you're proposing.
Absolutely. And I think on the R&D side, Julien, there's lots of programs. I mean, one of the biggest ones, of course, is IRAP, where you can get up to 80% of coverage for your wages that are involved in engineering or scientific research related to what you're trying to do.
Maybe one point on this one, because I've seen IRAP extremely proactive these days, an excellent program, well funded, with sometimes having I would believe a proactive approach, where we seen that they connected with companies explaining that we have funds for defense. We think that you could provide something, but if you are proactive and have an idea that would fit with their objectives, let's go and connect with them. They are very, very helpful in determining how they can support. They see IRAP is a program where they see themselves obviously as a funding partner, but also a technology development partner to make the project work and make it commercialized properly. Very, very good program.
Julien, thank you so much. I was going to stop you there, but you stopped anyway. Fantastic timing. We're at time, so I want to wrap soon. I also wanted to just plug in CANSEC in Ottawa on May 27, 28. BDO Canada will be there. CADSI, of course, will be there. Mindy will be running around, running the show. We would love to see you there. If you're coming, please connect with us on LinkedIn or through the poll. A big thank you to CADSI, Invest Ontario. Garrett, we appreciate your efforts trying to join us, but appreciate the notes. Hopefully I was able to, and the group was able to bring some of the insights that you were going to bring. Thank you for all of you who joined us. And Paul, Mindy, Julien, thank you so much. And have a great rest of your day.